It might be helpful for our panelists to just know how many of us have been to China. If you can put your hand up and just let them know how many have been to. So a fair number of people here. Yeah, it's very impressive.
How many agree that China's rise will be peaceful?
Everybody. Yes. Well, I have a question here, and it's of a historical nature, and it's, let's take this as our first question from Hilliard Lubin in Camden, and takes us back to the time of Mao, when Hilliard writes, Mao was our friend in World War II. Both were fighting the Japanese, both helped defeat them. How come Chiang Kai-Shek ever rose to power? From what value source? And then he adds, Sun Yat-sen's daughter only? So I shared that question with Michael ahead of time, and I'll open it up with you, Michael, and if anyone else on the panel wants to make a comment, that's fine. So, question.
Mao and the United States were not exactly friends in most of the Second World War. I mean, Chiang Kai-shek actually was the major friend of the United States at that time. Chiang came to power in 1928, and around about the 1930s he came to power on a very radical platform, but sort of switched it somewhat, and by the 1930s, he's backed primarily by the United States. And when the war broke out, Chiang and Mao was technically supposed to be allied with each other, fighting against the Japanese. I use the word technically advisedly because they were really, at the same time, also very soon thereafter started fighting each other again. So there was actually three fronts, if you will, in China at the time. Chiang's national government, nationalist government, down in the southwestern part of the country. Mao's communist regime, primarily at that time in the northwestern part of the country. And then the Japanese occupying all the major cities and transportation line. And the main point of contact and support from the United States is towards Chiang's regime down in the southwest. So when the Japanese surrendered in 1945, the civil war broke out between Mao and Chiang Kai-shek, and America was firmly behind Chiang Kai-shek at the time. Chiang just happened to lose and fled to Taiwan, and with the nationalist regime, and Mao came to power. There was some contact between some members of the American government with the communists in the beginning, in the latter part of the war. They went to Yan'an, which is northwestern part of China, visit with the communists. Actually, a lot of them, the one thing to remember about them is that they actually filed a lot of reports about the communists at the time. And a lot of them, the way to remember them best is that a lot of those officers American government officials, who filed reports on the communists in the latter part of the war as a kind of exploration of who the communists really were they our friends, were they our enemies, and so on. They actually went into trouble during the McCarthy era. A lot of them went into big trouble for being communist sympathizers, for their relatively, I wouldn't even necessarily say positive, but maybe not critical enough, some positive, some maybe not critical enough assessment of the communists. Some of them describe the communists as agrarian reformers and so on. And then those terms got them into real trouble in the early 1950s in the US.
I invite other panel members to pitch in.
Yeah, I will not say Mao is a friend of U.S., was a friend of U.S. during the war. Mao himself was a pragmatist. He just tried to use whatever forces, his United Front theory, to use whatever forces that could help him to win in the war or in the power struggle. So he worked with nationalists during the war against Japan, to that extent also worked with the US. After the war with Japan, he tried also get US on the China side, on the communist side during the negotiation with nationalists. When the negotiation was broken, and he was in a war with nationalists. In fact, the US policy at that point was let dust settle down. US did not really intervene to the civil war in China, and the communists win over the civil war. He, at that point, I think Mao Zedong tried to get US to recognize so-called the new China and try to send a message to U.S. But at that point, the U.S. government was very, very upset about the victory of communists in China, and it was debating in Washington about who lost China. So in that case, the Mao regime found they could not get U.S. on their side, so they turned to the Soviet Union, leaning toward the one side in a global struggle between communism and capitalism.
Thank you. Bob Cap.
It seemed to me the essence of the question was, how did Chiang Kai-Shek come to power? And at least that was part of the question, and that goes back to the 20s when Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, and Chiang, a military leader within the loose and rather disorganized ranks of the Chinese Nationalist Party and movement, got a military expedition together and moved it from Canton up through central China to Shanghai, drove out and managed to drive out the warlord government, which was still trying to call itself the National Government of China in Beijing, and then basically established modi vivendi, or modi vivendi or something, with lots of territorial militarists around the country to involve them in a loose coalition under his national flag. And he persisted as the de facto leader of the government of China, recognized by the rest of the world from 1928 until 1949, and for the United States well beyond that. One other thing to say is that this period that Sam just talked about, the Who Lost China period, which was all wrapped up with the notion, of course, that we were falling into a terrible Cold War with the Soviet Union. We were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. That period of 48, 49, and the debate over who lost China enshrined China as an icon in a domestic U.S. Political discourse, which continues actually to this day, and it's sometimes hard to remember how much of the animus and the fractious debate over China that ripped the intellectual and the political communities in the late 1940s and in the 1950s traces its descendants down into some of the dialogues that persist even now in appropriate or relevant parts of the opinion community in the United States.
Michael?
Just a very quick addendum on the values of Chiang Kai-shek's government. It's actually not that different from the contemporary government in the 21st century, in a sense. Authoritarian government, economic development, control of society, and so on. It's just that the nationalist government never really had a chance in the 1930s. I mean, they were much weaker. There was a threat of a war against Japan. There was, of course, a communist challenge at the same time. But the values, in many ways, are actually not all that dissimilar for what the communist government is trying to do today.
Especially since Marx is nowhere to be seen anymore.
Yeah. Before moving up to usher number 3, anyone else have any other comment? Up to another question from the balcony here.
Hi, my name is Amy Zader from College of the Atlantic, and I want to point out that the title of this conference has been China on the World Stage. And a common theme that has come up is that when we're talking about China, we're often referring to the political power in Beijing. And I've spent a lot of time in Beijing and seen this political and intellectual power in Beijing. But I've also lived in Sichuan for 2 years. And the people in Sichuan and the people in Beijing have different values and have different material possessions and access to different things. And when we're talking about progress, or China's progress in this conference, a lot of times we're talking about Beijing and working on the assumption that what's good for Beijing is good for everyone in China. And I'd just like one of you or any of you to elaborate on how good US-China relations and economic growth and progress in China, how we can be assured that that will benefit everyone.
John, would you like to make a comment there? No.
No, actually.
Well, we'll come back to you later. Anyone else? Rom?
Well, I'd love to meet you if I can before I leave, because Sichuan was my doctoral topic, and I spent some time out there myself, and it's just a fascinating place. And certainly, when you get to Sichuan, you think, "Holy cow! Now we're really in China." After Beijing and Shanghai, it really, in some ways, is a different world. But that is an interesting question. I mean, the quickest thought that comes to mind is that really no foreigner, I think, let me generalize, John can correct me because he's had more time on the ground there, but I would say no foreigner can go out and conduct a purely local relationship with people out in the provinces and down in the villages without coming to the notice of, and if necessary, being brought to heel by people of higher authority in this unitary structure. So you're right, Beijing isn't the whole country. And you do have to wonder, as I tried to say yesterday in my comment about whether the social bases of this unitary structure were rotting out or were rotten, and whether that would cause structural, really severe existential issues for the regime at some point. You're right to say that just because a person is in Beijing and works in a big think tank or works for some ministry and talks about China, he or she may not, in fact, really know what he's talking about, let alone be representative of what people around the country think and need. But the converse isn't true, and that is that you can go out and engage internationally with people. The world cannot engage with local China without the central government watching and in some cases saying, no, you can't do that. That's the whole problem with the NGOs now, which we hope will gradually recede, but the regime has gotten very tough on NGOs who are out in the provinces and the villages doing useful micro and otherwise socially productive activities, but who are constantly watched because by definition, if they're international, if they're part of the globe at large, it doesn't matter how local their work is, that is of concern to national administrative structures that blow the whistle from time to time.
Phil, could I invite you to comment here? Because at lunch yesterday you were telling us a little bit about taking students around China and your experience in doing that.
I think that whenever Westerners go to China and we visit Beijing and we visit Xi'an and we visit Shanghai and we see this picture here, it's hard to not to use the word miracle, when in fact the economic development, this boom that's taking place, is not in fact universal in China. Sichuan is one of those places where you can go and you can still see villages that don't have running water, or villages that don't have electricity, where there are large numbers of people living in poverty. Interestingly, Sichuan is also I believe, the largest sender of migrant labor. So when you visit factories in Guangdong province or you visit factories outside of Shanghai, more often than not, those workers there come from Sichuan. So I think an interesting question to ask is what is that interaction with the world, even if it's secondary, doing to Sichuan province? Well, you look at the villages outside of Chengdu now, and these small houses that existed 10 and 20 years ago are being torn down. And people are putting up 2 and 3 and 4 and occasionally 5-story homes. The quality of life is rising in these areas. Most of these people have satellite dishes atop their 5-story homes. And you can get a sense that this money that is trickling in, not from any direct investment in those villages, but rather from people going out, migrating out, spending a few years in the city and sending money home, is in fact having a quite dramatic effect at raising the local economic levels.
David.
I'd like to just respond to the first part of your question, not about Sichuan, but you did bring to attention the title of the conference, China on the World Stage, and it set me thinking about the last 2 days and the extent to which we've really addressed or not addressed that subject. To this yesterday afternoon session we began to, but I'd like to make the point that I think we need to keep in perspective China's relative impact on the world stage. You know, if one breaks it apart into different categories of influence on the world stage, one finds different levels of influence and impact. There was a now deceased China watcher named Gerald Siegel in the United Kingdom who published an article in the last year of his life called "Does China Matter?" And the article basically argued that China doesn't matter. China's just a medium term or medium power with no global reach and no global impact. And I disagreed with that article at the time, as I did with much of what Jerry used to write. But one has to sort of step back and think. China on the world stage, does it matter economically? Absolutely. That we have heard, and that in spades. Does it matter militarily? I would say not at all. China is not an international military actor in the least, and in fact is not really even yet a regional military actor. It does not have the capacity to project power other than ballistic missiles. Yes, they can put a ballistic missile here in the harbor. But other than that, no aircraft carrier battle groups, no force multipliers, no bases abroad, no soldiers stationed abroad, no long-range intercontinental bombers, no long-range attack nuclear submarines. China does not have, and Mike Pillsbury may disagree with me on this, yet a military power projection capacity and does not have any kind of global military presence. Then if you look at China politically on the world stage, one finds China now involved in the international system and all the institutions of the international system, both UN and others. It's a member of the club. It's now in the club. And Robert Zoellick's whole speech about being a responsible stakeholder was that being a member of the club has responsibilities. And if you look, for example, at the UN dues, China pays 1.8% of the UN operating costs. Germany pays 14%. So one has to sort of ask, is China stepping up to the plate, and this is what Zoellick asked, stepping up to the plate internationally, commensurate with its size and power and on a global basis? Is it contributing to solving global problems? Peacekeeping operations, international health threats, international criminal threats, terrorist threats, so on and so forth. Zoellick's basic, if you read the fine print or between the lines of that speech, he was arguing, no, China has not stepped up to the plate internationally yet, and he was trying to encourage China to do so. So if you look at the political level, it's sort of mixed. Then two other quick indicators that come to my mind. Energy. Yes, China is increasingly on the world stage, as Liz Economy and Phil have told us, and that's only going to increase. And then finally, sort of soft power indices. To what extent is China a global actor in soft power terms? I would argue not very much. Intellectually, the major patents are not being created in China. Chinese intellectuals are not winning Nobel Prizes as long as they're working in China. Yes, some have won them having emigrated abroad. Contributions to social science, innovations, or in the humanities, you don't see that coming out of Chinese universities. So in that area, high culture, yes. As Ambassador Lilly was speaking in his opening speech, popular culture, is China penetrating popular culture in the world? John may have some views on this. I would say no. Ideological appeal? Absolutely not. They don't have an ideology. Nobody wants to copy it anyway. And political, soft power. Nobody wants to exactly copy that system. So it's a kind of mixed bag, but I would argue China is not on the global stage in terms of soft power. So your question kind of just spawned those thoughts, over the last couple of days. I don't know if any of my colleagues want to react to those, but we're not there. My point is, let's not inflate China's importance. They are an increasingly important power, and it depends on the category. But if you look broadly speaking, compared to the United States, and you run through those categories, or even the European Union, you get different answers. But let's not, maybe Siegel overstated the case when he said China doesn't matter. China clearly does matter, but it's not a global superpower yet, and except in the economic domain, and it's not going to be for some time, in my view.
Thank you. Michael, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes. It's like
I thought you did.
By now you should know what I'm going to say about Sichuan. First of all, as they say, I'm glad you brought up Sichuan. And on the theme of giving you something that you can really use for your $200 ticket, when you go into a Chinese restaurant, many people from, almost everybody from China knows this, but almost no foreigners. There is a spice it's grown in Sichuan, and it characterizes the best Sichuanese food. It's called huajiao. Huajiao means flower pepper. So next time you're in a good Chinese restaurant, you need to ask, does your Sichuanese food have flower pepper? Most don't in the U.S. because they think Americans don't like it, and they have a good reason for that. Americans, Westerners, have 4 flavors, but China has a 5th flavor. And Sichuan is famous for its strategic role in thinking about strategy. I was going to ask the student, I didn't catch your name, but the student lady, if you ever went to the Zhuge Liang temple in Chengdu. Zhuge Liang was China's greatest, or maybe second greatest strategist. There's a big temple to him in Chengdu in Sichuan today. And one of his many strategic techniques, which he copied from the Warring States, has to do with this flavor, this 5th flavor that China has that we don't have. And every time you hear about China's peaceful rise, I hope you'll think about this 5th flavor. You know what it is? In Chinese, it's called ma. It's a second tone. It can't really be translated because the word ma is a compound particle for other words in Chinese that mean numb, to paralyze, to render complacent. The best one is ma bi. For you Chinese language students, second tone, 4th tone, ma bi. Bi means to prevent, to make someone not do, bi mian, make somebody not do something. So ma bi means to induce a sense of, there's no big problem here. And the flower spice, the huajiao, when you add it to mapo tofu, mapo bean curd, or several other Sichuanese dishes, if it's good, if it's a fresh, and I asked Professor Zhao if what I'm saying isn't the gospel truth. If it's fresh ground flower pepper, and there's lots of it, your tongue will get numb. And that's the flavor. The 5th flavor is numbness. Numbness. Now, do Americans have sweet and sour and sugar and bitter? But do Americans have numbness as a flavor? No. But after you've been told 3,000 times about China's peaceful rise, you begin to get numb. And the Sichuan I know Bob Kapp's PhD thesis about Sichuan. Mine actually has a chapter 2. The Sichuan I know consists of the following 4 things. Besides the temple of the greatest strategic thinker, Sichuan is the headquarters of the nuclear weapons program. So when you ask about, does economic benefit help everybody? Well, I hope that Sichuan's startling economic growth will help its nuclear weapons designers have better places to live, because that's where they're concentrated. And if you want to go there, it's up in a place called Mianyang, up north of Chengdu. You can't go in because of lack of transparency. Number 2, Chengdu is the headquarters of one of China's largest military forces. It's called the Chengdu Troops. They're the ones who are in charge of Tibet. So when you hear about Richard Gere and people concerned about Tibet being crushed over the last 50 years, the troops come out of this wonderful Sichuan province. That's where they're based, that's where they're controlled. So nuclear weapons, the troops for Tibet, the troops are also responsible for Southeast Asia. Oh, one more thing. I know you're all interested in India. The missiles that are aimed at India, that have caused India to come to the United States to ask to buy weapons, a lot of weapons, are based in Sichuan. So yes, I think Sichuan's a wonderful place. We should all go there and visit. Unfortunately, when our student groups are in Sichuan, we can have the flower pepper spice, but we can't see the missile bases or the nuclear weapons program or the troop headquarters or what's driving India to ask to purchase from us P-3 long-range patrol aircraft, Aegis destroyers, missile defense, a multi-billion-dollar arms program, and says all good people are against arms races and arms buildup. This is not a good thing that India wants to arm itself to project power out into the Indian Ocean, because whose oil goes through the Indian Ocean? China's. So the Chinese are strongly opposed to the U.S. selling the planes and ships and missile defense and other things that India wants to buy from us. President Bush, who I know you all don't like, he's going to India. He's going to India next week, or 2 weeks from now. So when you read the local papers, you might want to take a look at what he says to the Indians about their arms sales requests, because believe me, the Chinese will. And my answer to the Chinese when they get concerned about some kind of Indian-American alignment to hurt China during its peaceful rise, I always say, couldn't we have a little more of that flour, peppers, you know? Don't worry.
I have another question here, Bob, but just one brief remark to sum up that particular topic.
Two fingers, as they say, meaning a brief intervention. Don't try to bring that stuff into the United States. If you get caught with it passing through immigration, you're going to be in the pokey. It's
true.
Huajiao is illegal in this country because it's considered to be a narcotic substance.
Well, that's very helpful advice.
That's how we'll defend ourselves against the devious Chinese.
Well,
That's very true. That's very true.
that was a very helpful postscript there. Well, I understand there's a cheer goes up in the picker room when one of their questions is asked. So this one is from the picker room, and it's Dave Jackson from Rockport, Maine, and it's asking about Chinese education. Someone please comment on Chinese education system and how it compares to that of the U.S., if possible. So, John.
I can talk a little bit about
John.
that. From the basis of my classmates, many of whom have high school educated children. They don't do physical education whatsoever. They study to about 2 a.m. They have to memorize everything. They wake up at 5:30 in the morning, and it's rote, 100%. Very difficult. The competition to get into an excellent school in China, excellent university in China, is extremely intense, much more intense than it is in the States. And when you ask them what their hobbies are, about 80% of Chinese kids say their favorite hobby, and this is hobby, is sleeping. It's something that they, love to do. It's not Frisbee, it's not collecting stamps, it's not doing other things that kids did, at least when I was a kid. When they get to university, however, no one studies at all. Everybody plagiarizes. And the plagiarism is not just in university, it also goes up to graduate students as well and into the academies, especially in social sciences. I can't speak so much about the hard sciences, but I know in social sciences that's what happens. There's a lot of partying in university, and they don't cut classes because their grades are attached to their class attendance. But when the test time comes, they don't have proctors. Everyone basically cheats. It does create, obviously, some excellent people. They're very, very smart, but their system is skewed towards a lack of creativity, at least. And I mean, there are other people can say other things, but this is what I've noticed. And interestingly enough, in China, I've never really met somebody who really, really loves their job. You just don't. Even actors and actresses and singers who, for example, even Zhang Ziyi, when I interviewed her, I asked her, do you love your job? Actually, it's interesting. She's not as cute as she is in a photograph. You ask them, do you love their job? And they say, well, I really don't know because this is what I was told I was going to be doing since I was 12. It's very much top down. When you ask people who are high school kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? Basically, it's like, well, what my dad has working out for me because he has guanxi, he has connections in the local daily or the local economics ministry. And so I don't get a sense of an educational system that teaches people to be curious and to wonder.
Thank you. Any other comments about Chinese educational system vis-a-vis the U.S. educational system?
I can add a comment that is maybe a little bit less rosy than that. One of the interesting contradictions in a socialist state is that education, primary education, is not free. And in fact, in most rural areas, it represents a quite sizable portion of farmers' income. So oftentimes in poor rural areas, households will have, say, 2 children, and households will struggle with the following decision: which child do I send to school and for how long? So on average in certain Western provinces, kids are still getting 6 or 7 years of education and then dropping out at that point because schooling becomes unaffordable.
One question from the balcony, and then we'll come downstairs here.
Chris Beebe from Camden. I don't want to mention the word threat because I've heard that that's not a word you want to bring up around here. But obviously, some of the reason that I think a lot of us are interested in China is its very rapid rise, and particularly in relationship to the U.S. And maybe this is a question that is more U.S.-oriented and doesn't have to do with the conference, but certainly I would wonder if any of you could comment on comment on what are the U.S.'s strengths going forward, and how optimistic are you about our strengths, and how can we improve? I guess you could answer that from a political or an economic basis, but any comments you might have certainly might be helpful.
Thank you. Anyone want to handle that one? Bob?
It's not really an answer, but that's what I was trying to get at in my final question on, I guess it was the first night, as to the, I'm sorry, it was last night when Liz and other people were on the stage, as to this kind of pervasive sense in the United States now that we can't seem to do anything right, and we don't seem to have any way of influencing by force or by persuasion the behavior of other countries in directions we want them to go, whereas the Chinese seem not to be able to do anything wrong. They make friends all over the world and so forth and so on. My concern, and I think there are grounds for concern in this, and part of it, there was a flippant answer to that last night, let's wait 3 years, and everybody kind of knew what that meant, and the implication was we'd have a different regime in this country with different outlooks. I'm skeptical myself, for example, about whether the Democratic Party would give us much ground for comfort in that regard, even though I have lots of problems with this administration. But the thing that worries me, in the night sweats part of my life, is what if the United States, in fact, is left with its only real strength being a military and coercive strength? That is, what if we get to the point where, yes, we still are the only superpower from the standpoint of the magnificence of our military technologies and our ability to project power militarily, we can take out anything we want, anywhere, anytime. Is the United States, can we avoid going down that road? And I hope Michael will comment on that, because Michael is so much closer to the security dimensions of America's presence in the world than I'll ever be and ever have been. But one does worry a little about the notion that the American position becomes defined so overwhelmingly in security and in military terms that the rest of it becomes less and less viable or less and less competitive in and of itself, whether it be soft power, universities, business, whatever else it might be. So I haven't answered your question, but your concerns are mine as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Michael? And then Sam, you.
Well, your question, as I understand it, is really what can we do to play to our strengths? And I think there are 2 or 3 things, and I'll try to link each one to a hamburger or pancakes or something. The Chinese dream for the future of the world, besides that they keep the hegemon numbed during their peaceful rise, they have a vision of a future world, but they're very frank about it. They would like 5 sort of equal poles. Professor Zhao said this, actually, toward the end. They would like a multipolar world, which they seem to have borrowed from Richard Nixon, of all people, in which the United States, if it has any aggressive tendencies to use force or to do something bad, the other poles of the world, Japan, China, Russia, Europe, sometimes they throw in India. That's a big debate now in China, whether India should be counted or whether it's just a sub-pole. So that it's an old balance of power concept focused on the United States as the bad guy. That the United States is really the cowboys and the bad people and God knows what they might do. But if we have a multipolar world in which the other four powers could unite if needed to constrain the bad guy, then we'd be much better off. That's sort of, it's a bastardized version of the Chinese dream of multipolarity. And actually, when you think about it, it's not that different from the American vision that you'll find in the CIA study of 2025, which is on the web also at www.cia.gov, that we would like to see a multipolar world. We don't really want to dominate in the oppressive sense, but we're losing the battle. The Chinese are busy trying to draw the European Union over to their side. They've made a lot of propaganda out of the Iraq. The fact that the United States does not have a United Nations Security Council resolution when it went into Iraq. And this resonates a great deal around the world. It sort of adds to the idea this bully is kind of not just a bully, he's like a monster. He's a renegade. He'll do anything. And we catch the Chinese sometimes quietly telling everybody in the world about the Americans as a renegade power during their peaceful rise. So I think the Chinese have very wisely laid down the challenge to us that if we spoil or allow to deteriorate our relations with Russia and Japan and the European Union, it's very bad. But then ask yourself about strengths. Who in theory has the greater strength to have the rest of the poles of the world be with us? It should be the United States, in theory. Values, economy, there's lots of, our hamburgers and cheeseburgers. I promised you that. The other challenge where we could play to our strengths, it seems to me, especially with the other powers, is the idea that China needs a democratic political system, by which I mean very clearly an opposition party. China needs to have the joys of the New Hampshire primary. China needs to have the joys of a powerful Congress that summons members of the administration up and makes them disclose everything. China does not have these joys today. So their peaceful rise, from my point of view, cannot be as joyous and as happy as it would be if the Chinese Communist Party would split in two. We know there's different points of view inside the Communist Party in China, at least two big points of view, and have sort of like the red Chinese Communist Party and the blue Chinese Communist Party. And they would run for office, and they could attack each other. They could invite us to come in and give our favorites. And they could control the budget of the military buildup. They could decide the Sichuan deserve more benefits, or should we give it all to the Northeast? But China doesn't have this today. So it may come down to our own national survival over the long term, whether we and our friends in the world can persuade China's peaceful rise to include a democratic party system in which you don't go to jail if you try to register a political party, which is what happens to you today in China. So I hope that's two examples of strengths we could play to.
I know Sam's got a comment on that.
Okay. In response to the question, what is the U.S. advantage or strength in dealing with China? Bob Kapp said the military force has been emphasized. I don't think that's the best approach. U.S. should set a good example. U.S. is in a position to set a good example for China in many aspects, such as in last 20 years, U.S. the free market system. China has learned from U.S. and U.S. Rule of law, liberal democracy. All those moral strengths has been very powerful to be attractive to the Chinese. And Chinese, from what I been working with, the Chinese has appreciated that, even though sometimes they don't feel very comfortable when U.S. pushed for human rights, for democracy, and for freedom of speech. But in the process, many Chinese people, even at a very senior level, they told me that's what China should go in the long run. They cannot deny that's the right direction, good thing U.S. could offer to China. In terms of military strength, that's in fact a lot of very good instrument for U.S. to deal with. As the only instruments, or to see that's the powerful instrument to deal with other worlds. Chinese people has been sometimes laughing at U.S. Way of working with the world. Someone mentioned yesterday about U.S. image in the world. U.S., for example, in Iraq, often I heard Chinese people, they really cannot understand why U.S. put itself in that kind of position. And in fact, last week I had a Chinese diplomat came to me. He also joked to me, said, if U.S. go to Iran, wow, that would be really good for China. Because China, as I mentioned earlier, China was seen as the #1 threat after the end of Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The September 11, U.S. went to war in Iraq, really changed dynamics, put China in a different light in the U.S. relationship with China. So if the U.S. go to Iran, they would need China more than they are now. So, but that's not a good example. China will see U.S. strengths. That's a weakness of the United States, in fact. So in terms of U.S. strengths to work with China, U.S. should take advantage of its free market system, its democracy, rule of law, those very good aspects. Earlier, I want to respond to the Sichuan question. Maybe I just briefly mention that when we talk Sichuan, we not only talk about spicy food, for sure, and also not only talk about, very charming panda. That's another very important aspect in Sichuan. We are talking about a relationship between U.S. and China in a more mature and a more multi-level, multifaceted relationship. That's very important. I think you are very correct that in relationship between Washington and Beijing, the security issue has been very big emphasis. But there are many other issues. There are many other levels of relationship should also be emphasized in this very important relationship. For example, in terms of levels of relationship, now the state-provincial level relationship and city-to-city relationship has developed reached far beyond Beijing. I come from Colorado. We have a state-to-provincial relationship with Hunan province, which is another spicy province, by the way. And also we have a sister city relationship with Kunming. It's also a very inland city. Colorado now, the export to China has been #3. Surpassed Japan last year, Canada, Mexico, now is China. So we reached far beyond Beijing. That's very important. I don't know how much men has been doing that. Earlier, one person talked to me about here you have program try to bring young students from China, have those kind of exchange programs. I think those will benefit not only people in Beijing, and also benefit people far beyond Beijing in provinces. And also multi-issues, economic issue, security issue, and cultural exchange, all those issues should be brought up, and also be promoted not only from top down, not only from Washington and Beijing, from bottom up. I think this kind of conference in Camden is a very, very impressive so far. And this is going to turn out. In China, also, I saw a very similar situation. In fact, I'm impressed here, 500 people, the keynote speak over 1,000 people. I remember a couple years ago, I gave a speech in China, not in Beijing, in Nanjing. It's a southern capital, they call that, in a party school. The room was also packed. I talked about U.S.-China relationship from American perspective. The audience was also very interested. So there was also very big interest beyond Beijing in provinces. Mm-hmm. So people-to-people contacts, non-official contacts are very important.
I know John and David have something to say here before we move to microphone 2, but could I ask that we try and compress our answers simply that I've got a whole wodge of questions here and I'm not sure we're going to get through them all. So over to you, John, and then David.
I'll be very fast. I just wanted to respond to the question about what things in the United States are good and how do we compare with the Chinese. I think in the United States, even though it's gotten a very bad name, the role of religion is extremely important, and it has informed the way we deal with ourselves, each other, and the rest of the world, for better or worse, and sometimes not always to the standards, is extremely important. And religion is effectively, or belief systems have effectively been snubbed out in China. And I think that's a huge difference between the two societies, just in the way people deal with each other. And I think even though that's a bit murky, it does affect how the countries will develop in the future. And it's one of the key reasons why I'm a cautious pessimist about China's rise.
Before taking that question over there, I'd like to read this one from Bill Greenwood and ask the panel to be thinking about this, because I'm going to ask you all to comment briefly on this. He's from Harpswell. Is there a conference this weekend in a small town in China regarding the United States? So be thinking about that, and over to question 2.
I'm a student from Belfast Area High School, and we've been talking a lot about United States and China relationships and the strengths and weaknesses of both. But one thing that I've sort of learned and heard and gathered for myself is that one of China's greatest strengths would possibly be its flexibility to be able to change. I mean, it's been truly unique. It's special economic zones and just the way it's risen in the world. To even think of China on a world stage now and have a conference about that is amazing and like was said, almost a miracle. But I was wondering, if you look at the major world powers, Europe has had to change and become more flexible with the EU, and China has had to become more flexible. But the United States, going back to its strength, has the United States become more flexible? And if so, should we? And how exactly? And how should we try to keep up or team up with China? I mean, what would be, in your opinion, the best interests dealing with China and our relationships?
A geopolitical question there on China and the U.S. Bob?
That's coming back to the question about what are our strengths. The question is that still a strength? We have to hope that it is. The educational system here, as John suggested, by contrasting China's, for all of its faults and all of its failings, emphasizes a kind of, at least in the ideal, a kind of an autonomous and self-directed use of the mind, which has stood America very well for a very long period of time. When you read books now, there are books coming out now about the Chinese miracle, how China's broken the bank, blah, blah, blah. And what they all show is a series of entrepreneurs in China freed from the strictures of the Stalinist system, who are spectacularly opportunistic, just amazingly opportunistic, and flexible and agile to the instant, fast. And the question arises, part of the reason they can do that is the legal system is a shambles, and they often have buddies in the administrative bureaus that grease the skids for them. But the question is, within the structures, for example, of large American corporations, is it still possible to be flexible? American companies are not well, in the tech sectors, particularly the very advanced tech sectors, we still see some of that, and in the venture capital zone we see it. But large American corporate structures now, are they showing themselves to be flexible and able to be instantly opportunistic? I think the jury is out. Some of you will know better than I. But that's what we need as a country, along with the fact that, regrettably, we need, as the Brock Commission said in the 1980s and others have said ever since, we need a workforce which essentially can anticipate doing lots of different jobs over the lifetime of the working person. And I'm not sure at the level of we're all sitting around with our PhDs from Ivy League schools, but in other sectors of the economy, whether we've reached that point with the American workforce yet either. But like everybody else, I would say we need to.
Okay, for this question, which is really getting at the Chinese perceptions of the U.S., but just take it as it's read or comment briefly. Michael, I'll start with you. Is there a conference this weekend in a small town in China regarding the United States? Any comment, Michael?
I know, but I can't tell you.
I will put two Michaels. And the next Michael? Yeah.
I'll just copy his answer.
John?
There's a little town on the coast called Beidaihe, and if you consider that a small town, I'm sure there are many conferences, but it's not with people like you. Most of them have uniforms or Mao suits. Well, actually, it's suits and ties these days.
But there are centers of American interest all around the country now. There really are. I mean, you'll find professors getting groups together. It's not going to be a town meeting like this. It's not going to be, 500 local citizens usually. But there's a lot of organized interest in knowing more about America around the country, primarily in campuses and intellectual environments.
David.
I would say, yes, there's organized interest in institutions who specialize in America, but my answer to the question of whether there's a similar conference in some village in China today is no, and that goes to one of the strengths, the question of strengths of America. What we've been doing here for the last 3 days is one of the strengths of America. It's called civil society and public education. Chinese don't organize themselves into this way. They don't have that opportunity. The government doesn't give them that opportunity to meet as a public, as you are doing. There are academics and there are intelligence agencies and there are government organs that do that sort of thing. And people talk around the dinner table about the United States with some regularity. But this kind of town hall meeting, public education, I would submit, has not come to China yet.
Mm-hmm. Sam, your experience?
Yeah, I agree with David about this entirely. The civil society is very weak at this time in terms of comparison with the United States. And it's impossible unless in a resort place organized by the government. I mean, Camden is very beautiful. They can find a place like Camden, put together a conference by the government, but not from bottom up, initiated by the civil society, by the communities. In relation to that question, I want to make another point that we really should set good examples like this to let Chinese know how the American civil society, how American system is running. And they are, learning from that perspective. A story I heard, I was involved last week again. The University of Denver, we are having a very important gathering in September of 12 Nobel laureates, including one of them is Dalai Lama. And the Chinese government heard that and was very unhappy, very upset, said, how could a university, a diplomat from Chinese embassy called me and said, how could a university like Denver do that? Even Yale, even Harvard would not do that. How you do that? China is number 4 economy now in the world. How can you do that? I was really shocked. How can you do that? This is America. And so they said, can we set an appointment with university chancellor to tell the university to cancel this? I said, you can come, but I can tell the result. You will not get it. And also the city mayor, the city of Denver also involved in this event. They said, can you also set up an appointment with the mayor? We'll talk to the mayor if you can cancel that. I said, you can come. But this is organized by a civil organization. They call a Peace Jam. It's not by the government. The mayor participates. The chancellor participates. But it's initiated from the civil society, from the community. So they came last week, 2 diplomats. One from political division, one from educational division, because they came to university, they have education division person came. And then they asked me, how should we talk to the chancellor? How should we talk to the mayor? I said, you can tell whatever you want, tell them, but you don't expect anything. Come out of that. Then the meeting went well, they talked of friendship, then they told them the consequences, you invite Dalai Lama. But the chancellor told them very clear, this is not politics. This is a community event. Then they did not get anything out. They said, oh, this is so difficult to deal with American civil society.
Phil.
I'll answer this question about interest in the U.S. with an anecdote of my own. A month ago, I was in Shenzhen with a group of students from Colby College, and we were having a discussion with migrant laborers there. These are mostly young women who had gone to work in the factories. Most of these women had 6 or 7 years of education at most, and they were working in shoe factories and the like. we were very interested in their lives and what led to their decision to migrate to the booming coast, and so forth. And then they had an opportunity to ask us questions after we had asked them questions. They were interested in campaign finance reform, and they were interested in America's strategy in Iraq. What person in the United States with 6 or 7 years of education knows about campaign finance reform? So I'd say that the level of interest is enormous, even if there aren't conferences held all over the place.
Great, thank you. Up to usher number 1 here.
Bob Sargent from Sargentville, Maine. Professor Zhao, your peacemaking facility is amazing as you deal with these various objections to your conferences and so on. Your anecdote yesterday about the evolution of the title of the conference you're going to do down the road was entertaining and instructive indeed. Could you replay that for us, please? What was the language, the offensive language, and what did you change it to?
The original title was, in fact, I changed it already 3 times already. The very first was the challenge of rise in China, implications for the U.S. Then they told me they at first did not indicate the first part they were not happy. They said, oh, it should have implication for China. So I put implication for U.S.-China relationship. Then they found this title, for quite a while. Then they wrote a letter to me last Thursday, just 3 days ago. Blue. I was really shocked that day. That this title, Challenge of a Rising China, is very offensive to China. Means, as I read the letters, that means the challenge comes from only China, not from both sides. So they asked me to take that away. Put away is emphasizing on cooperation. So the new title I mentioned earlier, they suggested is very, very smooth, very, not energetic at all for our community. And I try to attract as many people as 500 people like this one in Denver, or 1,000 people. So the new title they suggested is U.S.-China cooperation, U.S.-China relations, new opportunities, and challenges for cooperation. So emphasis now is cooperation.
Bob?
Our time is running short, and I want to pick up on what Sam has just said, to try to say something that's rather convoluted. I think in a sort of metaphorical sense, there's another threat involving China that I seem to be the only person who worries about. After an incident in January when the People's Armed Police shot up a bunch of peasants during a peasant disturbance in South China over a land dispute, 8 members of the Congress sent a letter to the Chinese ambassador just ripping China to shreds over what had happened. And the last line of their letter, this was signed first of all by Henry Hyde, the chairman of the House International Relations Committee, and Nancy Pelosi, the House Minority Leader. The last line was, "As we celebrate this season of peace before the new year, we offer our sincere condolences to the families of the victims of the shooting in the December 6th incident, and offer the hope that the people of China will soon be served by a government worthy of China's great historic and cultural tradition." That was Nancy and Henry's final line. Now, let me just spend a minute on something that really bothers me.
You did say Nancy is the Democratic leader of the House of Representatives.
No, I said minority leader. Minority leader.
But Democratic.
She's the leader of the House Democrats. That's
This
right.
wasn't something that the evil Bush people did.
No. Bipartisan. There were. No. No, not at all. There were 6 other members of the International Relations Committee. I think a total of 2 or 3 Democrats. The others were ours, and 44 members who didn't sign. But here's what I've been trying to find a way to express this. And these are personal opinions. Worthy of the great historical and cultural traditions, China's great historical and cultural tradition. Leave aside the fact that they're talking about a great historical and cultural tradition that had absolutely no concept of civil liberties or human rights, but was based entirely on an imperial and divine autocracy, leaving aside the fact that they don't know what they're talking about. At the moment, here's the essence of it. At the moment that letter was written, in the day, the week, the month, the year that letter was written, we've got people languishing in detention facilities with no access to legal recourse of any kind. Don't clap. Don't clap. You won't all agree on this, and we don't need to agree on this. I don't want to preach to the choir here. We've got that. We've got Abu Ghraib. We've got all these different things. And the thing that bothers me the most is that for 150 years, China has been a kind of a vehicle for the suspension of disbelief and the suspension of self-awareness of Americans about themselves. It really gets under my skin. It's as though somehow, when the topic is China, you don't have to examine your own society. And in fact, if you do, you get labeled either as an apologist for China, and no one should be an apologist for China, no one should be, or you get labeled as a blame America first, sort of always blame America person. But there's something about China and the mythos surrounding China in the American consciousness that leads perfectly smart politicians, among others, just to kind of lose perspective on themselves. And I think this is the thing that is the greatest threat of all about the emergence of China as a great presence in the global landscape and in our own landscape, is that we will lose perspectives on ourselves, even perspectives on our own strength in many cases, because China creates this kind of adrenalized and mythologized reaction among Americans. There's no talking to Nancy Pelosi and Henry Hyde about this, but it's an example to me of something where China really is a threat to the United States, and that is that we lose all kinds of perspectives on ourselves, positive and negative, when the subject is China. Thank you for permitting me to say that.
Anyone have any additional comments to Bob's comment there? Can I ask something here to get a read from the panel as to how, with your collective wisdom, you perceive the next, say, 3 to 5 years of US-China relations? And let's imagine we've got an optimistic, pessimistic meter, the barometer that we can kind of read. Are you very optimistic about it? Are you very pessimistic? Let's just kind of get a quick read on what from the base of your knowledge source and your experience will be the future in terms of pessimism and optimism. So, Phil, are you prepared to take that one?
No.
In the long run or the short run, Phil?
You could give me a very short answer on that.
I think that I have reason to be optimistic. I'm not necessarily optimistic that optimism will come to fruition, however.
Good answer. Sam?
I'll be both optimistic and pessimistic, because this relationship, Chinese former premier, I think Zhu Rongji, had a very interesting statement about the relationship. He said, this relationship 好也好不到哪里去，坏也坏不到哪里去 means it will not be good to a high level, not be bad to a very, very bad level. So, in fact, that shows a very good pattern of relationship. It's a cycle pattern. For last 2 decades or 3 decades, it has come up and downs all the time. So when it goes up, people becomes optimistic, and then it comes down, then you could be pessimistic. At this moment, I think it's up and very stable, relatively stable. So we don't know what is the next stage. Could be come down, could be stable, but I don't think they will go that high, for sure. So you should be both pessimistic and optimistic.
Okay, that's good. David?
It's a dialectical approach, Sam. I'm actually quite optimistic, and for a couple of reasons. First, because I feel that our two societies are now thoroughly integrated and interdependent with each other, and that's, to my mind, a very stabilizing force. Secondly, at the government-to-government level, I have great admiration for the Bush-China policy, actually. I don't have much admiration for the Bush policy elsewhere in the world, but when it comes to China, I think that it's been very consistent with the previous 7 administrations. And this relationship has been institutionalized at all levels. The governments are interacting, cooperating where they can, discussing differences where they have them. So at the state-to-state level, I'm quite positive. At the society level, I'm quite positive. I don't see any deal-breaker issues on the horizon. I don't think Taiwan is a deal-breaker issue today because of the increasing interdependence across the strait between the two and the prospects of a different government coming to power in Taiwan that will then initiate a political dialogue and work something out between the two sides. I'm concerned about Japan, as I said yesterday. The only thing that worries me is American xenophobia, an American insularity, an American sort of knee-jerk, reactive approaches to the world, not just China. That concerns me, but I'm actually quite optimistic. This relationship now has been going on for 20-odd years, and it's pretty deeply grounded, I think. So I'm actually quite optimistic.
Bob, do you have time to comment? I know you have a taxi cab that's coming to pick you up.
No, I talked so much the last time I should shut my mic off.
Okay. John.
I would say I agree with Professor Zhao very much. I think Premier Zhurong was and continues to be a very wise man on U.S.-China relations. The only caveat I would say is that next year, if there are serious instability issues in terms of demonstrations moving into the Olympic year, U.S.-China relations will definitely have to deal with that tsunami, and that's possible. It's not probable, but it's possible.
Thank you, Michael.
I'm actually a lot more concerned about domestic developments in China than U.S.-China relationship per se. If any destabilizing factor occurred, I think it will come from domestic development in China. I'm not particularly concerned about U.S.-Chinese relationship in general. I think both sides will handle it reasonably well, at least in the foreseeable future. But the potential flashpoint, I think, come from within China itself. If anything happened domestically in China, that's when the relationship will be destabilized.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
In Zen Buddhism, certain questions cannot be answered.
Then we shall leave it unsaid.
I will answer with a proverb that my uncle, who flew bombers for the U.S. Air Force, gave me one time. I said, what's it like to fly these nuclear bombers all around the world and go up to the Arctic Circle and come back and never know if you're going to be told to go bomb the Soviet Union or just come home and have lasagna? And he said to me, flying is hours of boredom punctuated by moments of stark terror. And that's the U.S.-China relationship for the next 3 to 5 years. I'm optimistic, everything will go fine, but my little anecdote took place a few months ago at the Central Committee Party School, Communist Party School in Beijing. They had a multipolar conference with Russians, Japanese, Americans, Europeans, so that China could be in the middle. And at the very end, this quite brilliant Japanese diplomat, pretending to be a scholar for a couple of years, said, I think I get it about China's peaceful rise, but what about if Taiwan declares independence or somehow tries to leave the unity of China? And the Chinese scholar, who up to then had been saying peaceful rise every other sentence, leaned forward into the microphone, looked at the Japanese guy and at me and at the Europeans and said, we will show them no mercy.
Thank you. I'm going to take another question from the floor over here to usher number 2. And what I'm going to do with these questions that have remained unanswered is we're going to look through all of these and make a list of them and share them with the speakers afterwards so that you can see generally what's on people's minds that haven't had the opportunity to raise these questions this afternoon. So, usher number 2.
Yes, Jan Terry from Rhode Island. Back to the cultural issues in China. We haven't talked at all. We have not addressed the fact of the millions of peasants and starving people who don't have an opportunity. And how long can they be pushed back and staved off, waiting for military growth to resolve the problem, which seems to be China's approach, is that eventually they will be employed. But what about now? What is really happening on the ground with these peasants?
Okay.
No, he's not a peasant, but he's well poised to answer.
I think Professor Brown could say a lot about this as well. I just think that you have two major problems in China among, call them the lower classes, the low middle classes, both urban, unemployed, and peasantry, is that the social contract, if you will, of the 1980s was that everyone was behind the reforms, which continued pretty much into the mid-90s, has frayed. And the bottom half, it's probably more than half of Chinese society is not getting the benefits that, and the sense that they're going to be participants in these reforms like they used to. As a result, you have 87,000 some odd peasant serious disturbances. You also have a very, very booming crime problem in China, which is not reflected in the statistics because police departments aren't allowing people to report crimes, because now there's a new Public Security Bureau order out that police departments have to crack a certain quota of crimes. So that means every time someone goes to report a crime, the cops say, look, don't report it because it's going to go on my ledger. And that is effectively small-scale class warfare. Whether that's going to bubble up into a serious problem for instability, for example, if mafia gangs can move from province to province, is another question. But I think that's a very, very interesting problem. And I have thought, looking at the December riots that you had in Dongzhou and Guangdong, where the People's Armed Police killed about 20 people, that could be a signal that China is moving into a new period of political instability. But that's just a guess. Because with China, a lot of times it's basically just a guess. But I think that you're going to see a lot more of these demonstrations, a lot more violent demonstrations, and they're not led by democracy activists from Beijing. They're led by populists who want a piece of the pie. And it's a much different tenor to these demonstrations. Right now you see the demonstrators fighting against local authorities, but generally having allegiance to the central authority. So they think, well, Beijing says it's okay. Beijing actually is saying good things, but it's just a local corrupt cadre who we don't like. That might begin to morph into a broader anti-regime type movement. And then you have the potential for that to be used by a faction in the party. But this is literally all guesswork. But right now, among the underclass and among the poor, there's a lot of discontent.
Just one brief thing to add to that is that the current leadership in Hunan were selected at least in part because of their strong rural resumes, and I think that they will be addressing these problems sooner rather than later.
Other comments from the panel?
Just one sentence. I always wanted to go back to the idea of what's called the ultra poor or the super poor by the World Bank. It means, and there's about 140 million, isn't that right, in China, of the $1 a day or less, the ultra poor. In some World Bank studies, it means not only no medical care. It means you cannot maintain your body weight. You're at risk, your children, for what's called stunted growth. But think about that. If that figure is anywhere near accurate, and I don't know if it is, of 140 million or even 105 million ultra poor in China, think for a second about the defense budget of China and how, if they had a two-party political system, what a wonderful issue candidates could use against each other. How can you want to buy more ships and submarines and missiles when we have 140 million people in our country who can't maintain their body weight and have no health care? I want to see China have that kind of debate.
But you also have 50% of the kids in Los Angeles high school do not graduate from high school. But we have a very, very big defense budget here as well. So.
Very good. Sam.
At one point, Phil mentioned that the current leadership has realized the problem. In last couple of years, especially since last year, they have tried very hard to take many policy actions to deal with this issue. In fact, a couple of years ago, there was a very famous investigative book published about, the title is 中国农民调查, the investigation of the Chinese peasant. That book revealed so many problems in the rural area, and it caused a big splash in the Chinese society. And at a certain point, I mean, the government tried to ban that book, but in the black market, that book was everywhere. And he revealed the local officials how corrupted and how they mistreat peasants, how many fees collected, fees collected from peasants. And as a result, he was sued by the local officials. And however, this has caused a big attention to the government. And this year, the central government has announced a very big policy action, that is to cancel and to abolish all agriculture tax. That's a very big staple for the Chinese government. And talking about education, also, they have canceled all the education fees for those provinces and inland areas in poverty. So that has been publicized. They tried to go around local officials, go directly to the peasants. So that's how they publish newspapers everywhere. So they have been trying to deal with that problem. But how successful it will be, we don't know.
David Chambao, Michael Chin, any other comments? Then I think that it falls on me to adjourn this year's conference for the Camden Conference, China and the World Stage. And would you please join me in showing your appreciation for the panelists?